Welcome, sisters. I am reading Leila J. Rupp's Sapphistries, A Global History of Love Between Women, Chapter 7, What's in a Name, 1890 to 1930. In Deepa Mehta's controversial 1996 film Fire, Radha and Sita, sisters-in-law living in loveless marriages in a joint family household, fall in love with each other. See figure 18 for a still from the film showing Radha and Sita. After a first surprising kiss, they discover passion in each other's arms. When they make love for the first time, Sita, who is younger and the instigator, asks Radha, quote, "Did we do anything wrong?" End quote, to which Radha replies after a moment, "No." One day, Ashok, Radha's celibate husband, discovers them in bed together. Sita is not sorry, but Radha wishes she had told him first. "What would you have said?" Sita asks. "I love her, but not as a sister-in-law." Now listen, Radha, there's no word in our language that can describe what we are, what we feel for each other, end quote. Radha responds, quote, "Perhaps you are right. Seeing is less complicated," end quote. Neither in this context nor in thinking about the naming of the desire between women, cross-culturally and historically, is the statement that, quote, "There's no word in our language that can describe what we are, what we feel for each other," end quote, a simple one. It is important to remember this as we turn to the consideration of the naming of lesbianism by Western sexologists and the impact and the lack of impact of what naming on various other parts of the world. For there have been many names for the love, desire, and sex between women, and there has been a great deal of unnamed love, desire, and sex between women. Both naming and leaving unnamed have their histories. A once familiar tale had it that until around the late 19th century, when sexologists categorized and named the lesbian, there was no notion of a kind of woman who sought out sex with another woman. In some times and places, any woman might fall prey to such a sin or crime. In other times and places, sex between women just did not happen. This idea was largely an echo of one about men's sexuality, since in the Western world and elsewhere, there was a long tradition of elite men taking the right to penetrate anyone lower in the social scale, including not only women but boys, slaves, servants, and members of the lower classes. Only an adult elite man enclosing another man, or desiring to do so, had consequences. This conception of male sexuality is what, according to the standard story, changed dramatically in modern Western history, when, as a result of the spread of new ideas, any man having sex with another man, no matter the part he played in the encounter, became a quote unquote homosexual. Our understanding of this trajectory for men has become increasingly more complex. But what is more important here is that no similar change in the idea of sexuality applied to women. That is demonstrated by the fact that the crucial question about the wives of women living as men was whether they knew about the actual physical equipment of their husbands. If they did know, their willingness to enclose male women as well as men did not make them blameless. Nor was the notion that some women desired and had sex with other women a novel idea in the 19th century. Consider what we have already encountered. In ancient Greece, tales of what Aeschylus described as quote unquote the warring Amazons, men haters, who according to Diodorus of Sicily were quote greatly admired for their manly vigor, end quote. Plato's fable of half females searching desperately for their lost female half. An Aztec Patlache who, quote, has sexual relations with a woman, end quote. In ancient China, women engaging in tuishi, eating each other, mojingshi, rubbing mirrors, tribads in ancient Greece and Rome, in medieval Arabic texts, and in medieval early modern and modern European, in modern Europe, heteristria in ancient Greek, women who had sex with women, Sappho, to whom the association of same-sex desire has clung for centuries, Sahakat, witches in the 16th century, Fez, who, quote, had sexual relations amongst themselves in a damnable fashion, end quote. quote-unquote God-insulting grannies, as the Orthodox Church in medieval Eastern Europe called women who had sex with women. Indian Svarini, Kokopa Warahin, Mojave Juane, Maricopa Quiraxame, Montenegrin and Albanian sworn virgins, all of whom became social males and sometimes pursued sex with women. Roaring girls and randy women, the new cabal and anadrine sex in 18th century England and France, Chinese sworn sisters, and the Urdu Doganas and Chapadbas, Saphists. Lots of names, lots of conceptions. Not only that women might make love to another woman when no men were in sight, but that some women might desire and seek out other women. And yet, some important new developments were in the works as the world became increasingly interconnected. It is those that we turn to next. Before the sexologists, where there seems to have been little idea of a person with same sex desires or a quote unquote kind of person was outside of Europe. In China, the Taoist tradition envisioned two forces, yin associated with femininity and passivity, and yang, a masculine and active force, which need to exist in harmony. What matters was not the biological sex of sexual partners, but the preservation of qi, the life energy found in semen or vaginal secretions. Since women's yin is limitless, no sexual activity between women could sap qi. Taoist ideas about sexuality had an impact on Japan as well, where male-male love flourished alongside heterosexuality. In all these contexts, sexual relationships between women as well as between men did not meet with condemnation, nor did they mark a woman engaged in sex with other women as a particular kind of being. Some scholars have argued that what is essential for the emergence of the notion that people with same sex desires are a kind of person is the concept of women and men as fundamentally different. In both the Chinese and European traditions, according to recent scholarship, the idea of women's and men's bodies as polar opposites is a relatively modern origin. Chinese physicians from the Song to the Ming dynasties, 960 to 1644, conceptualized the body as androgynous, viewing male bodies with too much yang and female bodies with too much yin as out of balance. In a similar way, ancient Greek texts presented male and female bodies as quite similar, and that model had staying power in European history, although how dominant it was and how long it lasted is disputed. According to ancient Greek thinkers, bodily fluids were the same, and reproductive organs um, comparable, with women's inside instead of out, making woman a lesser but not diametrically opposed man. Anne Lister, the turn of the 18th century female rake, read about Aristotle's concept of the female body as inside-out male and took from it the confirmation that her sexual desire for women was natural. In addition to changing the ideas about gender difference, another scientific development that played a role in European conceptions of women's desire for women was the quote-unquote rediscovery of the clitoris in the 16th century. With the practice of desecration, European anatomists began to notice this mighty organ which the doctors, if not women themselves, had forgotten since ancient times. Now recognized as the source of women's sexual pleasure, the clitoris became the counterpart to the penis, a role formerly reserved for the uterus. The doctors even agreed that the clitoris was essential in reproduction, for if a woman did not emit their seed during orgasm, they could not conceive. Knowledge of the clitoris gave rise to fears, as we have already seen, of what women with enlarged organs might do. Jane Sharp, a 17th century midwife in England, described the possibilities. Quote, "Sometimes it grows so long that it hangs forth at the slit like a yard," the term for a penis, "and will swell and stand stiff, as if to be provoked, and in some lewd women have endeavoured to use it as men do theirs." End quote. Sharp, like others before her, thought this mostly happened in Asia and Africa, but by the 17th century, as the cases of hermaphrodites and women passing as men made clear, the image of the tribad and her active clitoris was firmly entrenched in the Western world. The question for us here is, was the tribad, quote unquote, a kind of person? A 17th century English medical text would suggest so, going on from the description of an enlarged clitoris to add, quote, "and this part it is which those wicked women do abuse called tribads, end quote. A travel text from the 16th century connects quote unquote feminine wantonness in Turkish baths to activities in times past of the tribads, of the number of whereof was Sappho the lesbian. And we have already encountered the denunciation of English and French aristocratic women as tribads and saphists. But what caused tribadism was unclear. Perhaps women with unnaturally large clitorises pursued sex with other women, but perhaps it was the use of the clitoris that made it grow. And in any case, what were the limits of a normal clitoris? There is no agreement, then, about when in the Western world we can begin to talk about women who desired other women as belonging in a discrete category. But whether or not the 16th century tribad or the 18th century Sapphist represented a new conceptualization, what is clear is that these categories did not have the same global reach as the naming of lesbian by the 19th century sexologists, a name that stuck. By the late 19th century, European and US doctors interested in what they defined as deviant sexuality began to talk across national borders about the problem of individuals who desired and had sex with others with biologically alike bodies. Medical and scientific attention to same sex sexuality was part of the process of growing state involvement in civil society as a result of economic transformation across the industrialized world. The sexologists did not, of course, make up their ideas out of thin air. The emerging visible subcultures and communities of women, specifically men with same sex desires, both piqued the doctors' interests and provided material for their theories. The doctors differed on their question of whether people were born with same sex desires or acquired them for a variety of reasons, but all contributed to the notion that having such desires and engaging in same sex sexual acts defined one as a particular kind of person. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, the Viennese psychiatrist whose monumental and influential work Psychopathia Sexualis appeared in German in 1886, defined same-sex desires as a symptom rather than the defining characteristic of what he termed quote-unquote inversion. What was inverted or reversed was gender. A woman would think, act, and feel as a man, and vice versa. Krafft-Ebing distinguished four kinds of female inverts with increasing degrees of deviance. One category consisted of a woman who, quote, did not betray their anomaly by external appearance or by mental masculine sexual characteristics, end quote, but who were responsive to masculine women. Here we finally meet the wives of the female husbands. The second category was made up of women, quote, with a strong preference for male garments, end quote. The next women who assumed, quote, a definitive masculine role, end quote, and finally the, quote, extreme grade of degenerative homosexuality, end quote, encompassing women who possess, quote, who possess, quote, of the feminine qualities only the genital organs. Thought, sentiment, action, even external appearance are those of a man, end quote. Note that female masculinity, either as a characteristic of a woman or as her object of attraction, defined the female invert. Krafft-Ebing described one woman as, quote, quite conscious of her pathological condition, masculine features, deep voice, manly gait, without a beard, small breasts, cropped her hair short, and gave the impression of a man in women's clothes, end quote. If Krafft-Ebing paid more attention to dress and manner than sexual desire, sex came clearly into the picture with Havelock Ellis, a British sexologist whose early 20th century writings both opposed sexual repression and labeled women's desire for women perverted. Ellis, married to a lesbian woman, differentiated between the congenital invert, who could not help her condition and should therefore be tolerated, and the women in Krafft-Ebing's first category who possess a genetic predisposition for responsiveness to the advances of other women. These women, in an atmosphere such as a boarding school or a women's club, had the potential to become homosexual, and Ellis feared the advances of women's education and legal rights, along with the work of the women's movement, were creating a hotbed of potential homosexualization. The crushes, so prevalent in girls' schools, no longer seemed so innocent. As Ellis explained, quote, While there is an unquestionable sexual element in the flame relationship, this cannot be regarded as an absolute expression of real congenital perversion of the sex instinct. End quote. But if crushes between schoolgirls did not point to a congenital condition, the atmosphere of the school or the women's movement might put women in danger of being seduced. Here's how Ellis, with no evidence whatsoever, described the women who would attract and be attracted to true inverts. Quote, their faces may be plain or ill-made, but not seldom they possess good figures, a point which is apt to carry more weight with the inverted women than beauty of the face. They are always womanly. One may perhaps say that they are a pick of the women whom the average man would pass by. End quote. Swiss neurologists August Forel, like Ellis and Kraft-Ebing, differentiated between women with a quote-unquote hereditary disposition to inversion and a quote-unquote sapphism acquired by seduction or habit. The quote-unquote pure female invert, he wrote, quote, feels like a man, end quote. He cited a case in which such an invert, quote, dressed as a young man, succeeded in winning the love of a normal girl, end quote. Even after the invert was discovered and sent to an asylum, the quote-unquote normal girl continued to be amorous when she visited her lover. Forel, quote, took the young girl aside, end quote, to express astonishment at her feelings for the one who had deceived her. Her reply, he wrote, was characteristic of a woman. Ah, you see, doctor, I love him and cannot help it. Forel's and Ellis's attention to sexual desire moved closer to the notion of homosexuality as defined by the sex of one's chosen sexual partner, although they still placed great emphasis on gender inversion in the case of those born, quote-unquote, that way. In 1913, Ellis described inversion as referring to sexual impulses and tastes may remain those of the sex to which that person by anatomical configuration belongs. End quote. When Sigmund Freud introduced the distinction between sexual aim and sexual object, aim referring to preference for genital, oral, or anal sex, or for an enclosing or penetration role, and object to the desired partner, it makes a shift away from a focus on gender inversion. But this was true in the case of men and this was truer in the case of men than women, for the sexologists continued the long tradition of associating female same-sex desire with masculinity. It is not surprising, given the history we have already encountered, that the sexologists at the end of the 19th century returned to a consideration of hermaphroditism, either physical or psychological. Perhaps they thought these masculine women were partly men, because they had enlarged clitorises, or perhaps they had a mind of one sex in a body of the other, making them a quote-unquote third or quote-unquote intermediate sex. Such is the concept embraced by a number of male sexologists who themselves desired other men, including Karl Ulrichs and Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany and Edward Carpenter in England. In the Netherlands, the director of the Dutch Institute for Research into Human Hereditary and Race Biology in the 1930s sought to prove through analysis of identical twins that homosexuality was genetically determined. The female twins he found through the Dutch Scientific Humanitarian Committee, a spin-off of Hirschfeld's pioneering German organization, fit the traditional description of masculine women who preferred male activities, had deep voices, and felt no sexual attraction to men. The biological argument of a quote-unquote third sex was an appealing concept for people with same-sex desires, for punishment made no sense if they could not help being who they were. At the end of the explanatory continuum, or at the other end of the explanatory continuum, Sigmund Freud and his followers gave an enormous boost to the idea that social factors produce same-sex desire. Freud's attention to dynamics within the family to explain homosexuality took same-sex desire out of the realm of the biological. Yet both kinds of explanations, the biological and the social, lived on and continue to linger. One sexologist in 1919 claimed that people who had homosexual sex but in an appropriate sexual role, that is, passive lesbians or aggressive homosexual men, did so as a result of social factors, whereas aggressive lesbians or passive homosexual men could only be explained by, quote, biological anomalies of development, which are often coupled with unmistakable physical signs, end quote. But whatever the cause of same-sex sexual desire, those who had it increasingly came to make up a category of persons labeled homosexual or lesbian. The thinking of European scientists of sex research beyond the United States to Japan and China, becoming a transnational conversation about sexuality. In Japan, the importation of Western science followed the end of the Japanese resistance to contact with the Western quote unquote barbarians and the development of a more centralized state. The Japanese Forensic Medicine Association sponsored a Japanese translation of Kraft Ebbing's Psychopathia Sexualis that appeared in 1894, and the ideas about legal rights for individuals becoming known as homosexuals also filtered into Japan. At the same time, German sexologists made use of the knowledge about Japanese male same sex practices gleaned from Western travelers to Japan or Japanese visitors to Europe to describe a culture like that of ancient Greece, accepting of male same sex sexual acts. Japanese thinking about same sex sexuality focused almost entirely on male male lovers. The concept of homosexuality as referring to both male male and female female interactions was literally quite foreign. When Japanese forensic pathologists first encountered Western texts, they coined a term in Japanese meaning same sex intercourse to translate homosexuality, giving precedence to sexual acts, particularly anal intercourse. By 1887, Japanese texts mentioned quote unquote obscene acts between women using the German term tribari. It's like tribad. Yet Japanese authorities merged the concepts from the European sexologists with Japanese tradition, asserting that, quote, intercourse between females, end quote, was most likely to occur when young women lived closely together without access to men, as in prison or wealthy households. Eventually, the sexologists did place male and female same sex sexuality in the same concept category by the 1920s, adopting a standard term, doseiya, same sex love. As a result, Japanese experts began to pay more attention than they had previously to female same sex love. Loanwords such as lesbian, resubian, or garçon, garçon, from the French word for boy, being a masculine woman, became household words. By the 1920s and 1930s, same sex love had come to seem peculiarly female phenomenon as quote unquote as quote modern institutions of entertainment end quote distracted schoolboys from homoeroticism. This was one of the major ways that Western sexology affected Japanese thinking in this realm. Japanese sexologists, like their European colleagues, disagreed about whether same sex love was a biological or sociological phenomenon. Habuto Eiji, a well known early 20th century expert, distinguished between common feelings of love among pre adolescent girls or directed at a teacher and a quote hereditary element of mental illness end quote if such love lasted beyond puberty. The concept of sexual inversion emerged in the assumption of gender differences between partners, that one would be masculine and the other feminine. Some Japanese sexologists rejected such a notion and emphasized that it was sex segregation in schools, textile mills, prisons, convents, nurses' quarters, and hospitals that treated prostitutes for venereal disease that caused girls and women to turn to one another. Whatever the cause, same sex love might cause physical problems, including vaginal cramps, sterility, or insanity, or lead to suicide or murder. One sexologist even blames same sex love in girls' schools for, quote, declining birth rates in civilized nations, end quote. In China, as in Japan, the introduction of European sexologist concepts accompanied other forms of Western importation and fostered the new notion that male and female forms of same sex love formed a conceptual and unity embodied in the term Tongxing Ai, same sex love. As we have seen, female same sex bonds had a place in Chinese culture, but sisterhood and friendship characterized such relationships, and sex acts between women did not signify a personal taste or an independent eroticism. That changed in the course of the political culture and intellectual flowering of the post First World War May 4th era. Western oriented intellectuals embraced European sexology, sometimes imported through Japan, and spread a new term, female same sex love, which encompassed older concepts of relationships between women such as those between co-wives. Terms such as nuzi, nuji, tongxing lian, female homosexuality, and qingyuji yandao, sexual inversion, and yantai, perversion, came into Chinese language. Havelock Ellis's influence can be seen in the emerging distinction between sexually inverted women who displayed masculinity and the pseudo-homosexuality of feminine schoolgirls who grew up to marry Zanshai, a pseudonym to marry. Shan Zai, a pseudonym, published an article in a Shanghai's Women Journal in 1911 that quoted German and British sexologists and used German sexological terminology. He both asserted the similarity of male and female same-sex love. Quote, when a woman falls in same-sex love with another woman, it is in fact the same as a man's being fond of having sex with the beautiful boys, end quote, and differentiated between inverts and women who, quote, want to satisfy their erotic desire but have no opportunity to associate with men, end quote. He also mentioned Sappho, tribads, and nuns. Ellis was not the only sexologist translated into Chinese. Magnus Hirschfeld first visited China in 1931 and lectured in German with Chinese translation to 35 audiences. In addition, the texts of Krafft Ebing, Freud, and Edward Carpenter were translated and published in China. As in Japan, traditions of sex segregation came together with economic and social changes that were transforming gender and sexuality in a way that made distinctions between heterosexuality and homosexuality and ideas of sexual inversion make sense. In the case of Japan, intellectuals took what was useful from Western thinking and translated it, in both literal and figurative sense, into Chinese culture. The writings of the sexologists, then, did three transformative things. They presented homosexuality, whether the result of biology or social context, as a condition that defined certain individuals. They combined what was often been viewed as quite a disparate phenomenon, male and female same-sex love, into the concept of homosexuality, and their ideas had resonance in diverse cultures where other Western influences and processes of economic development created receptive audiences. It is ironic that European thought about same-sex sexuality, which had long associated it with foreign cultures, beginning in the late 19th century, created the conditions that underlie the contemporary notion much of the world that homosexuality is a Western import. New ways of seeing. It is easy to exaggerate the impact of the writing of a handful of elite European men. It is important to remember that they developed their ideas of sexual inversion and homosexuality from observations of and contact with individuals and groups of people who experienced same-sex sexuality. Despite the reach of Krafft Ebing, Ellis, and Hirschfeld, the others across national and linguistic boundaries, there was no immediate earth-shaking transformation in the ways that people thought about same-sex sexuality. Sometimes the new ideas came into play, sometimes they did not. In the mass circulation British press, for example, stories of women who dressed as men and married women took a tone of admiration for the boldness of such masquerades, and did not refer to sexual deviance well into the 20th century. A look at some famous cases allows us to see the complex mixture of old and new ideas in different societies. Consider the story of Alice Mitchell and Freda Ward in the late 19th century Memphis, Tennessee. Mitchell, a middle-class white 19-year-old, fell in love with her 17-year-old friend Freda, known as Fred Ward. At first, their attachment seemed to their families to fall into the familiar pattern of a romantic relationship. Then Ward's family intercepted and read some of their letters and discovered Mitchell's plot to dress as a man, run away, and marry her beloved. Alarmed, they sent back the engagement ring and other tokens of love, forbidding them to see each other. Even worse than Mitchell's perspective, Ward began to be courted by a man. Early on in their plans to run away, Mitchell had said she would kill Ward if she backed out of her promise to marry her. and in 1892 she acted on this threat by slashing Ward's throat on the streets of Memphis. Found insane, largely because her family's societal prominence made a conviction of murder unpalatable, Mitchell died in an asylum, either of tuberculosis or suicide. The case attracted attention from doctors and the popular press, not only because of its drama, but also because it seemed to fit so perfectly with the newly emerging paradigm of gender inversion and sexual deviances in as inextricably linked. That is, Alice Mitchell became the embodiment of the invert or lesbian in American medical and popular discourse. Her family's a strategy for the defense, was to have her declared insane, and so her attorneys constructed a case that portrayed Alice's mother as having had quote unquote mental troubles while pregnant, and Alice as a tomboy with no interest in the expected activities of girls and with an quote unquote extraordinary fondness for Freda. Quote, they were in very different positions. Fred was girl-like and took no pleasure in the boyish sports that Alice delighted in. Time strengthened the intimacy between them. They became lovers in the sense of that relationship between persons of different sexes. End quote. But by this description, the defense meant that the relationship was neither one of sexual love nor of the kind of romantic friendship that might lead to the ladies of Llangollen, like marriage. Rather, Alice's feelings represented quote unquote perverted affections, insane love, or morbid perverted attachment. Press coverage of the case raised the issue of hermaphroditism, avoided in the trial itself, suggesting the confusing mixture of old and new ideas that swirled through public opinion. One report noted that the insanity defense rested on the idea that Alice's insistence that she could be Fred's husband was delusional. Quote, the only apparent defect in this reasoning is the fact that it has not been proved that Alice could not perform the duties of a husband. None of the experts who had testified before the court have made an examination for the purpose of ascertaining that point. End quote. So even in the midst of language about perversion and morbidity stemming from the discourse of the sexologists, older images of hermaphroditic bodies and enlarged clitorises remained. In a case from Tokyo in 1888, many of the same developments can be observed. The daughter of an elite family named Fukuda had been romantically involved with her former maid, Maeda Otoki, for 13 years. When Maeda tried to kill Fukuda, thinking she had lost interest in her. She planned then to kill herself as well. The prosecutor tried to determine which of the women was the quote unquote husband, whether either of them had an unusual anatomy or whether they had used some kind of quote unquote instrument. The two women were guilty of the quote unquote obscene act of mutual masturbation, but that was not in itself a crime. A forensic pathologist concluded that Maeda suffered from quote unquote sexual inversion, indicating the impact of the new diagnosis. In between Memphis and Tokyo, at about the same time, the Hungarian court Count Sandor Vay was accused by his father-in-law of forgery and fraud since he, quote, was only a woman walking around in masculine clothes, end quote. Unlike Mitchell, Vay was a quote unquote passing woman who was raised as a boy, had affairs with women, and worked as a journalist and writer. In Budapest, where Sarolta Vay grew up, people knew that she was a girl passing as a boy. As the family solicitor testified in the trial in 1889, quote, in Budapest, nobody was bothered by that because everybody knew her, end quote. Vay met his wife elsewhere, and both she and her family claimed to have had no idea that he was not what he seemed. His father-in-law testified that one could see the shape, or rather large male equipment between Vay's legs, and Vay's wife reported that she had given herself to him and had no idea prior to his arrest that he was not biologically a man. Yet another witness, including servants, testified that they knew the Count was a woman. Another testimony alluded to the opinion that Vay was a hermaphrodite. The midwife, who was called in to examine Vay's body, reported on, quote, the female sex of the Countess and her small sexual parts, end quote. In the past, such a finding would have been the end of it. Vay's deceit would have been revealed, and he would have been either executed or restored to his proper sex. But here we see the emerging of the idea of sexologists beginning to change the story. The doctor who reported on the case to the court was himself confused, finding it difficult to deal with the masculine countess as a lady as much, quote, easier, natural, and more correct, end of quote, to think of Sandor as a, quote, a jovial, somewhat boyish student, end quote. He and another forensic doctor asked all kinds of questions about Vey's sex life, wanting to know what kinds of women attracted him, whether he had read anything about sexual inversion, whether he allowed his sex to be touched, whether he used his fingers or tongue in making love to women. Vey was no longer a passing woman. Was becoming an invert. The examining doctor concluded that he suffered from, quote, a congenital hereditary determined disorder of the whole nervous system, end quote, and a, quote, congenital pathological disorder of the mental capacity, end quote, meaning, quote unquote, sexual inversion. As in the case of Alice Mitchell, the doctors worked to uncover a family history of mental illness that would support the idea of hereditary disease, and they made use of the new concept of sexual inversion. But both Mitchell and Vey's trials stimulated extensive discussion in the mass circulation press and among experts. Kraft, Ebbing, and Ellis added discussion of the cases to their work, illustrating the way that actual cases, sensational stories, and scientific analysis interacted in a complicated way to create different versions of the modern quote unquote lesbian. In both these cases, as well as in that of Maeda in Japan, we see medical and legal authorities shifting from earlier frames of romantic friendship or gender crossing to a diagnosis of inversion or mental illness, yet the process is complex, as the love and desires of women such as Mitchell and Maeda and Vey drive the narrative as much as the abstract theories of the doctors. What women thought. We still need to ask, once the sexologists undertook the process of naming and defining the kind of people who loved others of the same sex, what did such definitions mean to women who loved other women? There is no simple answer to this question. Whereas language of perversion and morbidity offered little to them to embrace, the concept of a third sex could have its appeal. At the same time, even the positive pronouncements of the homosexual sexologists carried the potential to expose women living respectably in Boston marriages. For example, Magnus Hirschfeld's The Homosexuality of Men and Women, published in 1914, noted the frequency of same-sex couples creating, quote, a marriage-like association characterized by the exclusivity and long duration of the relationship, the living together in the common household, the sharing of every interest, and often the existence of legitimate community property, end quote. So for some women, the medicalization of same-sex love brought unwanted attention and shame. Some fell into the clutches of those who hoped to cure them in their desires. Others differentiated their romantic friendship from deviant lesbian love, or ignored the new concepts altogether. Still, others embraced the new definitions as providing an identity, even if a disparaged one, that made sense of their lives. Ethel Smythe, a British composer, feminist, and masculine woman who formed passionate relationships with women and with one man, seemed to be referring to the medicalization and deviance of same-sex love when she wrote to her male lover in 1892, quote, I wonder why it is so much easier for me, and I believe for a great many English women, to love my own sex passionately rather than yours. How do you account for it? I can't make it out, for I think I am very healthily minded, and it is an everlasting puzzle, end quote. Clearly reflecting the concepts of the doctors in her memoir, she characterized her eroticized mother-daughter relationship with the wife of her music teacher as, quote, a blend of fun and tenderness that saved it from anything approaching morbidity, end quote. And late in life, she considered whether an incestuous love for her mother was behind her passion for women. Janet Marks, a professor of English at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, who lived in an intimate relationship for 55 years with Mary Woolley, the college's president, was one who worried that others might see her as a lesbian. In an essay she wrote in 1908, she denounced as abnormal, unwise college friendship. In an essay she wrote in 1908, She denounced as quote-unquote abnormal, quote-unquote unwise college friendships, such as the one she had shared with Woolley, and insisted that the only relationship that could, quote, fulfill itself and be completed is that between a man and a woman, end quote. British writers Eliza Lynn Linton and Vernon Lee reacted in different ways to medical theories of gender inversion. Linton was masculine and erotically attracted to women, but considered gender inversion a sign of degeneracy and could only resolve her feelings by portraying herself as a man in writing. Lee embraced the notion of a divided self, a masculine intellect with a feminine feeling. Liu Yin, a May 4th writer in Republican China, wrote about same-sex love and expressed unease about her desires. Li Shi's diary, written in 1923, tells the story of a woman who does not wish to marry and whose feelings for her school friend, Yuan Qing, changed from quote-unquote ordinary friendship to quote-unquote same-sex romantic love. They make plans to live together, and Li Shi, that night, dreams that they are rowing a boat into the moonlight. Then Yuan Qing's mother forces her to move away and plans to marry her off to her cousin. Yuan Qi writes to Li Shi, quote, "Ah, Li Shi, why didn't you plan ahead? Why didn't you dress up in man's clothing, put on a man's hat, act like a man, and visit my parents to ask for my hand?" End quote. In the end, Yuan Qing repudiates their plan, and Li Shi dies of melancholia. Liu Yin herself married twice, but her writings suggest that she struggled with desire for women and worried that others might have quote-unquote dreadful suspicions about her. Others were less tortured, but worked to distinguish themselves from the pathologized subject described by the sexologists. In a 1930s autobiography, the pseudonymous American Mary Casale described her sexual relationship with another woman as, quote, the very highest type of love, end quote, and, quote, on a much higher plane than those of the real inverts, end quote. In the same vein, U.S. prison reformer Miriam Van Waters, in an intimate relationship with her benefactor, Geraldine Thomas, from the 1920s to Thomas's death in 1967, struggled to differentiate her own quote-unquote normality from the gender inversion and pathology of lesbianism that she denounced in the women's reformatory that she supervised. And yet, other women forged ahead with their relationships, despite their familiarity with the writings of the sexologists. M. Carey Thomas, president of the Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, kept lists of books labeled lesbianism and books on sapphism, and admired and followed the trial of Oscar Wilde. Yet she never expressed any unease over her overlapping relationship with the two loves of her life. German feminists Anita Aussprung and Lida Gustava Hayman, who lived together as a couple for 40 years, moved in transnational women's movement circles, familiar with the language of the sexologists, reported unselfconsciously in their memoirs about marriage proposals they were offered by their farmer neighbor. Quote, "It took all our effort to remain serious and make clear to the man the hopelessness of his desire. As he left, we shook with laughter." End quote. On the other hand, the concept of lesbianism as a defining characteristic allowed some women to embrace their own sexuality more fully. One of the women whose case histories appeared in Havelock Ellis's Sexual Inversion credited sexology with being, quote, a complete revelation, end quote, of her nature, and another credited Kraft Ebing with cluing her into the fact that her, quote unquote, feelings were, quote, under the ban of society, end quote, although she rejected his notion that she was unnatural and depraved. British feminist Frances Wilder expressed her gratitude to homosexual sexologist Edward Carpenter, since his work made her realize, quote, I was more closely related to the intermediate sex than I had hitherto imagined, end quote. Radcliffe Hall, who was, quote, overjoyed and proud, end quote, that Havelock Ellis put his stamp of approval on the Well of Loneliness, had her famous character Stephen discover her true nature when she finds a copy of Kraft Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis with her father's notes in the margins. Hall, a masculine woman herself, hoped that her novel would help young women come to terms with their desires, as well as elicit sympathy from heterosexual readers. See Figure 19, the masculine Radcliffe Hall and her feminist lover Una Troublebridge from 1927. When the book went on trial for obscenity, Hall's lawyers sought to convince the court that quote, the relationship between women described in the book represented in normal friendship, end quote. Hall was furious. A particularly fascinating source on lesbian reaction to sexology can be found in the research of the Committee for the Study of Sex Variance, a group of experts who undertook a large-scale study of homosexuality in 1930s in New York. Women and men who were recruited largely from an urban bohemian context provided family histories and underwent psychiatric and physical examinations. Following in a tradition we have encountered before, the gynecologist Robert Latu Dickinson set out to confirm his hypothesis that a woman's genitals would reveal innate sexual deviance as well as deviant sexual experience. In incredibly intrusive examinations, which involved measuring the clitoris with a rubber and the vagina with fingers, as well as tracing the vulva on a glass plate, the researchers sought to detect such signs as a large vulva, erectile clitoris, insensitive hymen, and small uterus. Not surprisingly, they found just what they were seeking, although with the expanded signs of inversion. What they did not expect, however, was what they heard from some of the subjects, who insisted on the pleasure of their sex lives and bragged about the ability to satisfy their lovers. Ursula, described appreciatively by her lover Freda as, quote, a big, bold, mannish, fat woman who heaves into the room like a locomotive under full steam, end quote, confuses the doctor, telling him that she finds Freda, quote, tiny and very feminine, very virile and aggressive, end quote. Refusing to confine sex to the genitals, she insisted that, quote, every part of the body become beautiful, caressing and kissing all the parts of the body. My sex life has never caused me any regrets, end quote. Perhaps playing with both traditional notions about lesbians and the experts' beliefs in the hypersexuality of black women, a number of African American subjects boasted of their sexual technique. Quote, I insert my clitoris in the vagina just like a penis of a man. Women enjoy it so much they leave their husbands, end quote. Or, as another put it, quote, I think they are fond of me because of my large clitoris. I think that's the chief reason. They comment upon it. They whisper amongst themselves. They say, she has a larger clitoris, end quote. And Marion J. insisted, quote, I became so expert in lingual caresses that I was noted in theatrical circles and in the fringe of polite society for my excellence. Sometimes I put my tongue in the vagina to increase the sexual excitement, end quote. Although the subjects of this study sometimes adopted the negative spin of sexologists, we can see that at least some of them played with those ideas and proudly asserted the superiority of their abilities and the rightness of their desires. So, across the globe, in different locations, women who loved women rejected, feared, or welcomed the idea that they were the kind of person who could be named. But it is important to remember that not everyone, even in societies where the ideas of sexologists circulated relatively freely, knew the names. One young British woman in the 1950s who was involved with another woman in college remembered telling a mutual friend about their relationship. Quote, she said in surprise, but you're really the most obvious lesbian I've ever seen. And my response was, the most obvious what? I'd never heard the word. I didn't know what she was talking about. She said, well, women who fall in love with another woman. And for the first time in my life, I had this to sort of sit back and think, oh, there's a word for something that I must be, end quote. The name lesbian was not the first to be applied to women with same-sex desires, but it was a powerful one. The women who formed romantic friendships or lived in marriages with other women or showed their masculinity or expressed desire for other women represented the source of the ideas of Krafft Ebing and others, and the stories of women such as Alice Michelle, Maeda Otoki, and Sander Vey circled back from the courts and the doctors' offices to the newspapers in the process fashioning the concept of the female homosexual or lesbian. It is hard to resist ending this chapter with Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness. Just gonna put that there. Which is all about the power of naming. Stephen Gordon's loving and sympathetic father finds Karl Heinrich Ulrich's works and takes, quote, to reading half the night, which had not hitherto been his custom, end quote. He is coming to understand that his daughter, Stephen, is what Ulrichs called an Urning, or a member of the third sex. He means to explain to his wife, Anna, who is cold towards Stephen, but he never can bring himself to utter the words. When a male suitor tells Stephen that he loves her and wants to marry her, she reacts with terror and repulsion and outrage. She goes to her father to ask him, is there anything strange about her? He thinks, quote, merciful God, how could a man answer? What could he say? And that man a father, end quote. So he lies, and then he dies before he can tell Anna or Stephen what she is. Stephen's teacher, Puddle, also finds herself unable to utter the truth. And then Stephen, quote, fell quite simply and naturally in love, in accordance with the dictates of her nature, end quote, with a married woman neighbor. Puddle sees, and she longs to help. She imagines going to Stephen and saying, quote, I know all about it. You're neither unnatural nor abominable nor mad. You're as much a part of what people call nature as anyone else, only you're unexplained as yet. You've not got your niche in creation, but someday you will, end quote. But she never does. Oh, but she does not. And then Stephen's married lover betrays her, and her mother turns against her. That is when she discovers the books locked away in her father's study. Quote, for a long time she read. Then she went back to the bookcase and got out another of those volumes and another. Then suddenly she got to her feet and was talking aloud. She was talking to her father. You knew, all the time you knew this thing, but because of your pity you wouldn't let me. Oh, father, and there are so many of us. End quote. Stephen recognizes herself as an invert and goes on her self-sacrificing way, ultimately giving up the love of her life. One of Ellis's, quote, pick up the girls whom the average man would pass by, end quote, forcing her into the arms of a male suitor. A Chinese literary scholar, Zhao Jingshen, in 1929, wrote about the banning of the Well of Loneliness, finding humorous the fact that an ordinary love affair between two women so upset the authorities. Yet he was perfectly aware of the language of abnormal sexual psychology and thought same-sex love and perverse. Such distinctions, like Hall's naming and Radha and Sita's inability to name their love, remind us of the complexities. So the naming of the quote-unquote lesbian was both momentous and not. It was not momentous because in some ways the term simply replaced old names for women who made love to one another, combining masculinity or attraction to masculinity with the propensity to engage in same-sex sexual acts. It was not momentous because the new ways of viewing women who loved women did not reach everywhere, and not all women exposed to the work of sexologists claimed or even reacted to the concepts. On the other hand, it was momentous because the quote-unquote lesbian, in all her cultural and linguistic variation, had a wider global reach as the ideas of the European sexologists spread to other parts of the world and merged with different cultural traditions. It was momentous because not only did it create a new concept unity between male and female same-sex sexuality in places such as Japan and China where there had previously been distinct, but it also gave the concept of lesbianism a Western origin. As we shall see, this change has its own momentous consequences, as the European notion of sex between women as non-Western perversion gave way to the idea of lesbianism as a Western import. And it is also momentous because the concept of lesbian underlay the development of different kinds of communities of women who desired women beginning in the early 20th century. Okay, so I'm going to end this stream and start a new stream to discuss this. Okay, bye.